Emily Galvin Almanza. We are joined today by members of the Louisville City Council, Brandon Cohn and Barbara Sexton-Smith. We spoke with members of the council last month as they contemplated banning no-knock, military-style police raids like the one that killed Breonna Taylor. In that raid, officers entered Breonna's home at 1 a.m. to execute something called a no-knock warrant for a person who didn't live there and who had actually been arrested already earlier that day. Officers fired more than 20 rounds, and at least 8 of them hit Breonna, killing her. Kenneth, Breonna's boyfriend, who had fired a shot in response to what he thought were robbers entering his home, was charged with attempted murder, but the charges were dropped 10 weeks later. Breonna's killers still have not been charged or arrested. Now, the Louisville City Council has since unanimously voted to ban no-knock raids like the one that killed Breonna Taylor. The law requires police to announce their presence and wait 15 seconds before entering a home. The City Council is now conducting further review of policing practices and working to create a new oversight that would change Louisville's public safety practices. Police, for their part, recently walked out on the mayor of Louisville, Greg Fisher, while he was addressing them because they viewed him as unsupportive. Yet Mayor Fisher has resisted reducing police funding, and even though it makes up a whopping 60% of the Louisville city budget. Years of police-involved killings and allegations of abuse have culminated in demands for a new vision of public safety. A city council working group is considering increased police investigation powers through an independent auditor general and a civilian review board appointed by the mayor. They would investigate complaints of police misconduct or abuse. Now, to talk about all of these developments, we are joined by members of the Louisville City Council, Brandon Cohn and Barbara Sexton-Smith, to tell us what's happening now, what will happen next, and what we should be thinking about for the future. Councilwoman, I'd like to start with you. Can you tell our audience how you see this ban on no-knock raids impacting police-involved killings of Black people, and what kind of real-time oversight you are hoping for to ensure that the new laws you pass will actually be followed by police?
Right, so that's a great question. And Breonna Taylor, we say her name, and every time I engage in a conversation, I always say her name first in honor of the life she lived, because Breonna Taylor trained and worked every day as a first responder to save lives. And so now in her death, lives will be saved as a result of the Louisville Metro Council passing Breonna's law with a unanimous vote. Councilman Cohn worked diligently alongside several other council members and myself to get this law passed. It is a complete total ban on no-knock warrants, and I see it having immediate effect because it was signed immediately by Mayor Fisher, thus putting it into law here in our community. And prior to the law passing, Mayor Fisher and the chief of police agreed to modify the police standard operating procedures in a policy format to ban no-knock warrants. However, it is incumbent upon every city council all across this nation to take a look at Breonna's law as it is written and to debate it and discuss it and put it into law in your communities, because I do believe that we will see fewer people killed, absolutely, as a result of not allowing the no-knock warrant. I think it's important to think about, how did we get here in the first place? Because a lot of people that I've been in contact with weren't really familiar with the phrase or the name no-knock warrant. Some people were. And most people understand that this became a tactic that was implemented in the 80s as part of the war on drugs, which many people believed, and I'm one of them, that the whole war on drugs concept was really a systematic oppression tool to incarcerate massive numbers of Black people in our nation. So I'm happy to be a part of the team here in Louisville, Kentucky that took the stand. And Emily, we passed Breonna's law in 22 days. And that in itself is a great story.
That is a great story. And it's a story we're excited to be talking about. One thing I did want to drill down on, though, is, so as a former public defender, I admit that I have seen instances where police have ignored the law, or where a very good law has been in place and police have not followed directives that they were given to increase public safety. What mechanisms has the city council put in place to ensure that they're not just going to ignore you?
Right. And that's another great question. So it was very important that one of the sections of BREONNA'S law dealt with what we call the penalty clause. And we had to be very careful, rightfully so, to not put something in an ordinance that would be in contradiction or in violation of the current collective bargaining agreement. And so as we reviewed that, and then also we did not want to put any penalty clause in BREONNA'S law that would be in contradiction to the police officer's Bill of Rights, which is part of our Kentucky revised statutes here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. So what we did is we approached the penalty phase of this law by approaching it through the Human Resources Department. And so therefore, complaints can be filed if a violation of BREONNA'S law happens. They can be filed through the same course of action that someone might in any type of violation of a personnel policy or procedure.
Interesting. All right. So you also have this role as chief liaison of the Compassionate Schools Project. And you recently completed the 7-year study in partnership with the University of Virginia looking at wellness and emotional health in children. So what's the role of childhood wellness investments in Louisville's public safety, and how would you say that compares to the role of police?
All right. Well, I think the role of public investment in childhood health and well-being may very well be the top priority of our nation, because it must start with the child first. And so the Compassionate Schools Project, as you mentioned before, is the world's largest longitudinal study of a health and well-being curriculum placed into a public school system. So during the past 7 years, more than 16,000 children in kindergarten through 5th grade in the Jefferson County public school system have been participating twice a week in a curriculum-based class, just like they would for reading or writing or arithmetic. And it is learning all about health and well-being and mindfulness and body regulation, conflict resolution, anger management, and emotional and social well-being. And it's based in part on Daniel Goleman's seminal work of the role of emotional intelligence. So it's critical that we invest in the mental health of our children and the physical health of our children. And the best place, in my opinion, to do that is in our public school system to start with, because that is where the largest number of children are. So as we move forward, as we will as a city council, on enacting additional ordinances and laws that will deal with certain law enforcement activities, one of the pieces of legislation I'm working on right now is something called a crisis response team. And I think that every community in America should pull away from their police department the funding that is used that helps our police officers respond to those experiencing homelessness, mental illness, drug and alcohol addiction. We must have trained behavior specialists in a crisis response team that is doing that work. And the same type of template could be used in our school system. So every school should have a department set up that is a safe place for health and mental wellness and well-being for our children, so we can keep them out of the pipeline to prison.
That's so interesting. So to be clear, you're talking about, in the same way that others have talked about a non-police emergency first responder option, you are talking about doing that in schools as well, taking police out of schools and putting another form of professional who may be more helpful and safer for children into that environment. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And if you think about when a law enforcement officer or candidate is going through the interview process, all you have to do is take a look at the current recruitment video for law enforcement to enter the academy here in Louisville, Kentucky, and you will see something that is quite mind-boggling. It looks like a warrior recruitment. I mean, it's full of excitement and a lot of intense interactions. And then what we do is we turn around and we ask the officers to go through the 26-week training academy, and they're trained in all aspects, and they get very little training in these behavior specialist encounters that I talk about. And statistics will show, if you just evaluate all of the reports of the types of stops an officer makes, it is seldom in their career they have the intense, high action, all hands on deck hostage situation that you see in a recruiting video, but it's all day, every day. They're encountering some individuals who really need behavioral health specialists. So I think starting in our schools, and then we talk about teaching de-escalation tactics to our law enforcement officers. Well, I think we start teaching that at the kindergarten level. You start teaching a kindergartner how to control their anger and how to breathe. I'm telling you, it really works. And we have the data that proves it in this 7-year study. It shows that children are going to the principal's office less often. They're being suspended less often at this particular age level. Their matriculation rate is greater and their student achievement is greater. The hope is that we can carry this curriculum into grades K through 12 would be my vision, then into colleges, universities, and workplace training, and then every workplace in America. I think we can do this.
I know I could use someone to teach me those tactics. Just
give me a call.
Councilman Cohn, I want to turn to you for a moment. And I want to talk with you specifically about what's happening in Breonna Taylor's case. So you spoke recently with Breonna Taylor's attorney about seeking justice for Breonna. So I'd like you to update us on the status of accountability for officers John Mattingly and Miles Cosgrove and former officer Brett Hankinson. Will they face charges?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on your broadcast. I'm happy to be here. And I just want, before I answer your question, I'll follow up on a couple of things that Councilwoman Sexton Smith said. And I'll say that the Justice Collaborative, and I want to give a special shout out to Keisha Hudson, who I've developed a relationship with over the last several weeks, has been a really good resource and someone that I've been really happy and proud to work with on understanding everything from no-knock warrants to some of these other policing and other urban city and criminal justice policy issues. So it's been really a privilege to work with the Justice Collaborative and some of your colleagues over the last several weeks. I know Councilwoman Sexton Smith and I work together on a lot of different policy issues here in Louisville. We both represent dense urban neighborhoods in a geographically pretty diverse area that has suburbs and parts of the county that are rural still. So we work close together. I'm sure she wouldn't mind me supplementing a couple notes that I took when you asked her questions. You asked me about accountability for the officers. You asked her about accountability, making sure that the no-knock warrant legislation is going to be effective.
Yeah, I was actually about to ask you about that next. How if these guys,
I'm sure I had the luxury of taking notes while she had to go first, right on a live broadcast. I'm sure she'd want me to remind people that our legislation now for no-knock warrants includes body cameras, which it didn't before. The city's actually had pretty broad use of body cameras in most police operations for the last several years, but it did not with respect to no-knock warrants. So now really the ultimate accountability is this required footage of the execution of warrants. And then also there's some reporting standards that are involved there. And then I also would just mention that we've already removed the police school resource officers from Jefferson County Public Schools, which is a separate entity, but that was removed actually a year ago, really due, frankly, to budget concerns as opposed to an enlightened policy decision. But in any case, the police are out of our schools, and our school board shares our views here and is looking for a new solution there. So I just wanted to say that in terms of the status of the case here in the killing of Breonna Taylor, people on the ground here, all eyes are turned towards the Attorney General's office, Daniel Cameron in Frankfort. Where things stand is that obviously the mayor of Louisville has the ability to affect these police officers' employment. The mayor of Louisville or the city council, we don't file criminal charges against anybody. We have to rely on prosecutors for that. So the mayor, as you mentioned, fired one of the police officers, Hankinson is his name, to remain on paid administrative leave, which I personally am unsatisfied with. I think that all three of those officers should have been fired from the very beginning, and I still think that's something that's not too late for the mayor to do. I think he should do that today, because we can only control what we can control, and there is a big difference between making an employment decision about somebody and then bringing a criminal charge and the impact there. But I feel very strongly that these officers should not be on our payroll currently. Notwithstanding, you asked about the status of any criminal charges. And again, the city has turned over our public integrity unit investigation, which is sort of the first step in the process here. I wish we would have gotten it turned over sooner. The city council tried to expedite that and put pressure on the administration to do that. Eventually, it was completely turned over, and we are waiting for the attorney general to give the public an answer as to whether any of these officers will be charged with anything criminal. You know, I'm unhappy, as I know most people in this community are, with the length of time it's taken the attorney general's office to review this case and make a decision. More frustrating is the fact that we're not being given any real timeline. And when we're not giving any real timeline other than to just to say we're going to take how much time it needs, I start to worry that people are messing around here and that this could drag on for months as we get, you know, closer to the election in November. And this is certainly nothing that anyone should be playing politics with.
Thank you for that. So I want to drill down a little bit on mechanisms for accountability, right? Because
Sure.
there's Daniel Cameron's ability to actually file criminal charges, which, as you said, the entire Louisville community is waiting for. And he's not in Louisville. He's in Frankfurt making a decision
Right.
from relatively far away. And then there's the mayor's ability to hire and fire. You mentioned in BREONNA'S law the requirement of body cameras and the possibility of an HR complaint. Although, I mean, I'm sure our viewers have a lot of questions about the rate at which HR complaints by civilians are heeded by the police department and by the mayor's office. So I'd like to give you a chance to talk more about what makes you feel that this form of civilian complaint will be powerful, and also about a third mechanism for enforcement, which is your suggestion to reduce the police budget by $27 million over the next 3 years and move that money over into social services. So if you can sort of compare and contrast the different enforcement mechanisms you're looking at here and the reception for each, I think that would be helpful for our viewers. Yeah,
well, I mean, all these issues sort of start to get conflated a little bit. I don't know really too much about an HR complaint. I might have missed that when I was taking notes during the first segment in terms of how any of that has to do with the no-knock warrant legislation.
I can just clarify quickly. Councilwoman Sexton Smith had said that the enforcement mechanism, so let's say police violate BREONNA'S law. Let's say they just bust down a door at 2 a.m., no knock. The people in that home, their recourse would be to file. I would like to know what the recourse is for people in that home if that happens to them.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't expect any civilian to have to file any kind of complaint when a police officer violates the law or any of their standing operating procedures. I think I've tried to make pretty clear by my stance about the employment status of these 3 police officers. I think it's incumbent on our police chief and our mayor to discipline officers who violate their duties and the law. So in terms of what recourse a victim might have civilly or something like that, I'm not quite sure. I may not be answering your question directly, but one of the things we're trying to do here generally is strengthen accountability in our police department every which way. And I think Councilwoman Sexton Smith mentioned that the city of Louisville does not have an independent civilian review board anymore, and we are working now to get one stood up. One of the things we did do right in the budget this past month, in my estimation, was fully fund an Office of Inspector General and a civilian review board with a budget that's equal to the size of the same budget as our entire city's internal audit budget. So a lot of times people say they're going to create an office of something and they hire one person and they give them a desk and they say they've done the job. That's not the case here. And the work is ongoing in standing up our civilian review board, but I have every expectation that that will be a real independent citizen-driven board with subpoena power, which we're working on changing state law for, and that will be real. And police misconduct violators will be held accountable in the future. You asked about the city budget. And again, cities all over America whose fiscal year started July 1st were dealing with their budgets towards the ends of June when this Black Lives Matter movement really hit its peak strength, and it's just something amazing to watch. In Louisville, I argued that we should, reallocate some of our police budget. People want to talk about defunding the police. I know for some people that's still confusing what that means. They take it totally literally. We weren't talking about abolishing the police department here in Louisville. But as Councilwoman Sexton Smith mentioned earlier, I think across the country there's broad consensus that right now police departments have workloads and responsibilities that are really beyond what they're trained to do, and actual budget dollars that follow those workloads and responsibilities. And I think that we need to start transitioning away from the police budget to public health and other budgets to respond to some of the things like she mentioned. It's not really controversial, I don't think. A lot of cities have acted a lot quicker than Louisville did in the last in the month of June in order to make changes for their fiscal 21 budgets. You can look at New York and LA and Minneapolis and Boston and many other medium-sized cities across the country. We were not able to accomplish that here. I did propose that sort of a 3-year plan to start to right size the size of our force and to try to diversify our public safety system. I can't really speak for why some of my colleagues were not as interested in that. I know that timing was an issue. There was not a lot of time to discuss things. There's a lot going on in the street here. It's a very complicated issue. And Councilwoman Sexton Smith and I are actually leaving the council at the end of this year. Our 4-year terms are up and we did not seek re-election. But I can say that I am certainly hopeful that my successor and her successor and others will really start looking at the fiscal year 22 budget as soon as possible for some significant changes in the police operating budget.
So let's talk about that. And this is a question for both of you. The next few questions are just grab them as you see them. Anybody can jump in. You mentioned right sizing the police budget. And I'd like to talk about what that looks like for you, because you mentioned alternatives to police, you mentioned alternate emergency first responders, behavioral health workers, and Councilwoman Sexton Smith, you also mentioned that the vast majority of police work is not what's reflected in the video you described, the recruitment video for Louisville Police. It's not this sort of like violent hostage situation emergency, but rather encountering someone who's experiencing a behavioral health crisis and trying to help or de-escalate, which is obviously more appropriate for someone who's trained in that discipline. It's a separate discipline than policing. So accepting your description of this as being the majority of what police are encountering, what's the right balance? Should there be, a minority of the budget devoted to policing and a majority for alternate forms? Should the entire budget be put towards alternatives? What is right sizing to you?
Well, right sizing to me would be a comprehensive approach, and it would take a multi-year approach, and we have to get started now. You have to take those first few steps. So for me, right sizing would be, let's decide what we want the Louisville Metro Police Department to do on a daily basis, what we want to hold them accountable for, and what type of law enforcement that we want in place in our community. And then everything that does not fit within that picture, we then pull apart, sort of like a pull apart bun, if you remember those from your grandmother's cooking. All right. And so for me, for example, we've already talked about the crisis response team. Those would be unarmed individuals. Another idea that's been put forth, and I think Councilman Cone has already mentioned Keisha Hudson, who really is a wealth of information, and I'm grateful for her engagement with some of us on the council, has mentioned another component to realign policing more appropriately would be unarmed traffic control folks. That could be the whole traffic division could be broken away from the police department. Why wouldn't that be? That makes perfect sense. And then as you start doing that, we start thinking then about the funding that goes with that. As we look at realigning our funding of the Louisville Metro Police Department, another area that I'm very interested in is we must ask our question, are we properly compensating and with the appropriate benefit package our officers today? That's been a very controversial conversation in our community. When we started looking at the budget, what a new recruit's annual salary is at the beginning and what their health insurance coverage is for fully covered benefits at the maximum level, it becomes a de minimis financial conversation for an individual who is thinking about entering the law enforcement academy. So I would be in favor of increasing those beginning wages and those salary packages if we possibly considered decreasing the number of members. At the same time, I want to make sure the total number of jobs in our community increases. And I think we can do that.
That's exciting to think about. So in terms of other steps needed to demilitarize the Louisville Police, as you think about shrinking the department, perhaps changing the compensation package, are there other steps that need to be taken to demilitarize Louisville Police, impact culture? Like, is this an uphill battle that you're facing?
Well, I'll climb any mountain any day. So if it's an easy task, there are other folks that can take that on. A lot of folks that know me know that I'm fond of saying I'm going to die in a minute. And so we got a lot of work to get done. And so what I mean by that is another technique that we could put in place is the violence interrupters. Violence interrupters is another very controversial conversation. We embraced it pretty well here in Louisville until we did not. And I am in favor of fully funding a violence interruption program because we had it in our community. I felt that it was working. And the district that I represent has half of our police division here in this community crisscrosses through the one council district that I represent. So what that means is I am looking at half of the police department's data on a weekly basis. Right. And we have 26 elected council members, which means there's 26 districts. And then we have 8 police divisions. So with that said, I'm seeing the violence interrupters were very active when we were funding them in the district that I represent. I knew many of them. They did great work. They could be grassroots, on boots on the ground, in the streets, in the alleys, in all the facilities, and folks will engage with them at a much different level, and they can de-escalate things more effectively, not using force than law enforcement typically is required to do.
Can I point out just one other thing about demilitarizing? Certainly, I'm glad Councilwoman Sexton-Smith mentioned that recruitment video, because that's something that I noticed years ago and thought had been a problem. And I'm proud to say that when we pointed it out to the police, they finally retired that video. It's not part of our recruiting anymore. And so we're looking at hiring a new chief. We're having our entire department evaluated. We're going to get at a new culture in our police department, which will certainly, if I can influence it in any way, have nothing to do with being a militarized kind of state of mind. Also, one thing we did do right in the budget, although I'm fairly critical of some of the decisions we made in terms of our budget this past year, we did make the decision to redirect some of our forfeiture funds, state and federal forfeiture funds that historically appear in our capital budget and go to pay for things, including military style equipment. What the council did is said, we want to redirect that state funding for de-escalation training, diversity recruitment, hiring programs and practices, and other kinds of, implicit bias training, the kinds of sort of baseline things that you expect from forward-thinking 21st century policing. And because we can't directly control the federal dollars, we suggested that be spent the same way. But that's up to almost $3 million worth of funding that could have gone towards sort of quote unquote militarizing the police that we did redirect in the right way. So I am proud the council did that this time.
Is there any legal capacity to redirect forfeiture funds to other community groups like violence interrupters?
I don't. So I think so. First of all, this is the best answer I can give you. I don't think we have the authority to redirect federal forfeiture dollars, period. We were able to suggest what the administration do with it. We wanted them to do with it what we asked them to what we told them to do with the state dollars. With the state dollars, I don't see any reason why we couldn't use it to pay for something like violence interrupters. We have an Office of Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods here in the city that, again, we had really severe budget trouble due to the state of Kentucky's pension crisis last 2 budget cycles ago that really devastated a lot of departments. And the Office for Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods was one that was decimated, frankly. And so we've had interrupters before. We probably didn't have enough, in my estimation, or enough trained doing the right things. Similarly, we also had a program with a nonprofit partner that was a pre-arrest diversion center for people that were experiencing mental health and addiction problems. We lost that in our budget a couple of years ago. So we're struggling with this issue of how to fund public health and public safety in the context of larger budget issues that we really didn't even, not to mention the coronavirus and the national economic collapse that make these all really challenging policy decisions. But again, I'm confident that the city of Louisville recognizes what needs to be done and is, we don't always go as fast as possible, but I think that we're in the right direction. We know where we should be going.
So last question for both of you, which is returning to sort of lessons you've taken from this and what's going to happen next. You mentioned all of these sort of budgetary crunches that had put the squeeze on community safety programs, non-police community safety initiatives. What lessons are you going to take from this process, and how are you going to ensure that, or do the best you can to ensure that $27 million you discussed is actually moved out of policing and into safety?
I'll answer that first one, I guess, since, my proposal was the best I could put together for this budget year in the amount of time that we had. It was designed to try to transition from the police department we have, and frankly, from the mayor that we have, to the next mayor and the next police chief and the next police department. And I'm sure my proposal wouldn't look the exact same next year. But the point is, I think more and more Americans are starting to wake up to the large systems that are in place. Not just individual cities' police budgets, but the real prison industrial complex and structures in our economy and in our criminal justice system that have treated Black people with brutality for centuries. And so, it's not just a budget line item question, and it's not about getting X amount of dollars from here to there. It's about American cities, including our city, responding to this moment, understanding what it's about, and really starting to try to change policies across the board to make sure that everyone is treated like a first-class citizen and that everyone has equal rights under the law.
Councilwoman Sexton Smith, I'll give you the last word on how to make your vision of a reinvestment in non-policing safety a reality.
All right. So as we think about this, in all of the, we average 1,100 police killings in our country on any given year, and that is completely unacceptable. These are the men and women who are sworn to protect us. And so the lesson that I think that we are beginning to look at, we haven't learned it yet, we're beginning to look at it, is that it took a pandemic globally screaming so loud that in Louisville, Kentucky, we didn't even hear a mother weeping right across town when her daughter, Breonna Taylor, was killed. Breonna Taylor was killed on March 13th. And yes, there was a press conference the following morning. However, it did not rise to the level of community-wide awareness until around May 10th, 11th, and 12th. That is completely unacceptable. So a lesson we have to look at, we don't know our history. And people said, Barbara, I wish you would quit talking about that. I cannot quit talking about the fact that we were not told the entire history lesson. None of us was. And what I'm talking about is the 401 years of racism and institutional oppression that began with slavery in 1619. And that then turned into the lynchings, and then it turned into 99 years of Jim Crow. It was 86 years of lynchings and 14 years of that civil rights movement. And then now here we are today. We really aren't that further along following 1968, the assassination of Martin Luther King, than we were then. And we just lost John Lewis. Oh my gosh, we need our next generation, 2 generations away from me. I'm a lot older than I may look. I need y'all to pick up this mantle, learn these history lessons. That's the lesson that I think we need to learn. And we need to start putting our money and investing in our neighborhoods. Poverty drives violence. We all know that. Poverty drives violence. And so we need to have a living wage across this country. We need to have reinvestment back in all neighborhoods. We need to have education for everyone. We need to have job and career training. We just need to provide housing, healthcare, better employment, and a better environment. That's all the folks are asking for in this nation, and it's our responsibility to deliver. It's been an honor to serve on the Louisville Metro Council with Councilman Cone. We each were elected to serve a 4-year term, and we started in 2017, and we each have independently decided to step aside so someone else can step up. And he and I will go forth and do things independently and hopefully bring forth better change for our community.
Well, thank you so much for that wrap up. And thank you so much, both of you, Councilman Cone, Councilwoman Sexton Smith. Thank you so much for joining us on the briefing. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. For our viewers, I will see you again at 3 o'clock. Today's a marathon day. We're going to be talking about COVID-19 in Florida. And I look forward to joining you all.